In early 1945, the war situation developed not necessarily to Germany's advantage, especially the surface fleet of the Kriegsmarine, wherein a majority of the larger surface vessels had been sunk previously, including one of the Admiral Hipper-class, the heavy cruiser Blücher, sunk in Oslofjord in 1940. However, two of the class were still operational, Admiral Hipper, who was having troubles, and Prinz Eugen, who was certainly in better condition. Nevertheless, there were still two incomplete ships, the Seydlitz sitting in the besieged city of Königsberg, and the former Lützow, the now Petropavlovsk, sold to the Soviets in 1940, never to be completed. The vessels all had interesting fates, whether at the hands of bombs, torpedoes, guns, scrapping, or Mother Nature. In this video, we will detail the fates of each of the Admiral Hipper-class ships. Starting with Blücher, she was laid down on August 27, 1935, and was launched on June 8, 1937. The ship began trials on September 6, 1939, and began the usual working up in the Baltic, like almost all other German warships do, continuing this until the 30th of March 1940, when she was released from her trials, albeit prematurely. This interruption in her training came at a critical time during the program of test and the indispensable intensive battle training to make sure the crew was ready. There were several reasons why Blücher was brought out of her training, but the main one was Operation Weserübung, the occupation of Denmark and Norway, as the Kriegsmarine was short of all units, and particularly powerful heavy ships. Any seaworthy vessel was pressed into service, even if lacking in battle readiness, really applying to Blücher than any other warship. She had carried out her gunnery trials, and only 2 of her 3 aircraft were aboard. Furthermore, what working up had been possible had suffered curtailment due to icy conditions in the Baltic. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper-class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, "The first days of April were used for shipboard drill whilst the cruiser was fitting out. Hundreds of life rafts and life jackets were delivered. In addition to the practice ammunition already aboard, in readiness for the cancelled gunnery training program, live ammunition was shipped and stowed on top of the practice munitions. As the aircraft hangar was used for bomb stowage, one aircraft had to be lodged on the catapult. Here, torpedoes had also been placed close by. Blücher left Kiel on April 5th, passing Labu towards 6 p.m. Aboard Blücher was Vice Admiral Oskar Kumins in charge of Group 5, or Group Oldenburg, the group of warships in charge of taking control of the Norwegian capital of Oslo, and to do that, control the narrow Oslofjord entrance. Blücher was not the only ship in Group 5, as it consisted of Blücher, the heavy cruiser Lützow, the light cruiser Emden, the torpedo boats Mauve, Condor, and Albatross, 8 motor minesweepers, and the converted whale catchers Rau 7 and Rau 8. Also aboard the ships were soldiers for the occupation of the city, and on Blücher there was an additional 822 soldiers and a total of 2,082 aboard the other ships. Also shipped were munitions and weapons up to light field artillery. There were several transports attached to the ships, not too close, as Oslofjord was going to be dangerous. In Geirhar and Tor Jørgen Mellin's sinking of the Blücher in the Battle of Drøbak Sound, April 1940. At 3 a.m. on the morning of the 8th, Group 5 weighed anchor and headed north towards the Danish belts in darkness. Blücher was in the van, Lützow, Emden, Condor, and Albatross followed. At 5:30, Mauve also fell in after having spent the night at anchor further offshore. The ships moved their way towards the entrance of Oslofjord, encountering British submarines along the way. But by nightfall, all German ships involved in Weserübung were either on their way to Norway or somewhere off Denmark, heading for their designated positions, ready to strike at Weser time. Now, I hate to disappoint anyone, but this isn't going to be an extremely detailed account of the Battle of the Drøbak Narrows, as I'm saving that for another video. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you're well acquainted with the outdated guns and torpedoes of Oscarsborg Fortress and the various other defenses surrounding the Narrows. For our story, we will cut to just before 4 a.m. on the 9th, as Commandor Captain Andreas Andersen and Oberst Christian Eriksen were deciding whether they were going to open fire on these ships attempting to pass their fortress. For Eriksen, the intrusion of foreign warships into Oslofjord was a breach of neutrality. He had no knowledge of any invasion, far less that the lead ship was Blücher. Even if he had no knowledge of any invasion, far less that the intruders were German. Sodom walked over to Eriksson and asked, "Shall we open fire?" The answer was shrewd and clear. Yes. Anderson asked for similar orders and received an equally clear answer. At 3:58 a.m., the torpedo battery shall open fire. Oberst Eriksson had made up his mind. He would defend Norway's neutrality according to his instructions. A few minutes passed as the lead ship of Group Oldenburg, Blücher, began to approach Oscarsborg Fortress. When taking from Haar in Mellingen, suddenly a tongue of flame shot out from ahead to port, followed shortly after a second similar stab a little more to the right. Oscarsborg had opened fire, and the improved shells would end Kumment's expectations of a peaceful takeover of Oslo. Eriksson's guns were some 25 meters above sea level, slightly higher than the level of the bridge of Blücher, which was 18 to 20 meters above the waterline. Angled slightly upwards, the 250-kilogram shell passed right over the port side of the crowded open bridge, making everyone instinctively duck because of the pressure before it exploded against the side of the foretop. Had not Eriksson aimed high, the entire command of Group Oldenburg would have been eradicated. Instead, the shell destroyed the base of the searchlight stand and blasted the main AA control position. The second shell, also HE, was aimed a little lower and slammed into the port side just after the funnel. The aircraft hangar was a wreck, both aircraft bursting into flames, including the one on the catapult that was partially fueled. The fireball that erupted was enormous, and burning aviation fuel flowed along the deck and into the interior, rapidly spreading the fires. The medical personnel aboard started to tend to the wounded when the Kopos and Uzvik batteries also opened fire on the Blücher starboard side. Once they saw that their guns were dealing damaging fire, they were ordered to do rapid independent fire, continuing to damage the Blücher, especially the superstructure. The upper works of Blücher were ablaze and seriously damaged, especially on the starboard side. One of the early hits on Blücher severed the rudder and engine telegraph cables from the bridge, as the rudder at that moment was trained to port due to a brief course change to passing Slosjer. Bulldog had ordered full astern on the starboard screw via voice pipe to avoid the ship running aground on Nordkolholmen. Emergency steering from the tiller flat aft, on orders given by voice pipe from the bridge, eventually restored some degree of control. Still, due to the time lag between steering orders being given and executed, Blücher started to yaw, and speed drop from 12 knots briefly gained. Fire from Blücher was erratic, going in all directions. After a while, though, the fire became more controlled, and when the cruiser passed in front of Husvik, some German gunners could fire down on the battery. The 20.3-centimeter guns did not open fire. The forward turret could not have fired anyway without traversing or elevating the barrels to avoid damage to the bow. In turret Bruno, the barrels were lowered so much that the indicator showed risk of damaging the ship if fired without being traversed. But no orders came, and the 20.3-centimeter guns remained silent. The medium and light anti-aircraft guns fired at what they could just before 4:30. The large ship emerged into the view of the torpedo battery, where 2 torpedoes shook the ship. The elderly Norwegian torpedoes hit close together on the port side, at least one in section 5 or 6, most likely both though. This was probably the most damaging place the 2 torpedoes could hit, right by the central engine room area. Turbines 2 and 3 in section 5 and boiler room 1 in section 6 rapidly filled with water. Most personnel in these rooms were killed instantly, and the rest got out as fast as they could. Several bulkheads were opened to the sea, and water poured into the ship. The damage control parties had no hope of controlling such levels of flooding. A list of 8 to 10 degrees to port developed, adding to the confusion and uncertainty aboard the stricken flagship of Group Oldenburg. 3 to 4 minutes after the torpedoes hit, shortly before 4:30 a.m., Blücher finally passed the kill zone of the Norwegian guns. She was now gliding forward, slowing down from 12 knots with a list of 10 to 12 degrees to port. The battle lasted 10 minutes. Over the coming 2 hours or so, Blücher would sink from the damage the Norwegians had inflicted, and her remaining crew and soldiers aboard were forced to swim to shore in the freezing cold water, where the time of the sinking of the Blücher varies between 6:19 a.m. and 6:32 a.m. The wreck of the cruiser can still be found where she went down, something that is worth a Google. As I mentioned before in this section, this is by no means an exhaustive account of the sinking of the Blücher. I just wanted to detail her loss and give you an idea of what happened to the ship. I plan to cover her loss in more detail, but in the meantime, I'll place links to some other videos about her loss in the description. I'll be sure to place a link to the Sinking of the Blücher book in the description as well. The ship had sustained serious damage during the disastrous Battle of the Barents Sea in late 1942, and due to the outcome of the battle, Adolf Hitler ordered the decommissioning of all ships of the size of light cruisers and above. Still, the Admiral Hipper in early January 1943 made temporary repairs in Norway and returned to Germany in late February for further repairs and decommissioning. Due to the worsening situation in the air, Admiral Hipper was transferred from Wilhelmshaven to Pillau in April with a skeleton crew aboard. For the remainder of the year, nothing of note happened to the ship, as due to the decommissioning order, the Admiral Hipper remained in Pillau. Where things start to get interesting again is in March of 1944, when the ship was recommissioned as a cadet training ship. The boiler room that was damaged during the Battle of the Barents Sea was still inoperable and remained shut down. The ship ran trials in the Baltic from April to August. In September, she was declared conditionally operational. Following the first cadet training cruise, which ended on October 26th, the ship was ordered to come to readiness for shore bombardment duties, something that a majority of the remaining Kriegsmarine units were doing. However, in November, the crew was employed in other work, namely digging anti-tank ditches outside Gottenhofen, or today what is Gdynia. The ship was confined to port after an extensive mine-laying campaign by the Royal Air Force in December. In January 1945, crew members were again sent away from the ship to aid in the construction of more fortifications in the area. Meanwhile, the cruiser went to the yard in Gottenhofen halfway through the month. Due to further air attacks and the deteriorating military situation, the repair work was hampered. By the end of the month, due to that terrible military situation, the ship was used to carry refugees to Kiel, some 1,500 people. While on this voyage, the ship passed the sinking liner Wilhelm Gustloff and cruised through survivors in the water, unable to stop because of the danger of Soviet submarines. By the 1st of February, the cruiser was secured in Kiel at the Deutsche Werke shipyard for boiler restoration work. A little over a month later, on April 3, 1945, the ship was bombed. By this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. The civilian populations of the cities had to hide in cellars, bunkers, or ruins, especially in the bombed-out city of Kiel. In the bombing raid of April 3rd, the ship received a direct hit on the starboard side, and 6 crew members were killed. On the 9th, in another bombing raid, the one that devastated the Admiral Scheer also devastated the Admiral Hipper, as the RAF dropped some 2,634 tons of explosives on the city. 3 more direct hits destroyed the Admiral Hipper's upperworks and superstructure, as you can see from this photo, which does an excellent job illustrating the carnage of the raid and the damage to the Admiral Hipper, especially in the foreground, the superstructure, and the funnel. The crew was not on board when the raid took place, taking shelter in the nearby U-boat pens, so there were no casualties on board the ship. Another great photo taken by British authorities was this color one, taken from the rear of the ship, and it also does an excellent job illustrating the damage done to the Admiral Hipper. Notice the damage here, and the overall condition of the ship. This was probably the most famous photo besides those of the Admiral Scheer capsized in Kiel after the war, at least for naval history fans. The wreck of the Admiral Hipper was essentially useless now, as the bombs had devastated the ship, and certainly beyond any means of repair that Germany could have conducted at the time. So when May rolled around, the ship was scuttled in its dry dock. Then, when the British took over the city in May, the ship was found in that condition. To take from Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War the fate of enemy fleets after 2 world wars, on May 23rd, a British status report of vessels at Kiel noted that T1, lying on her side, S201, and M801 had been blown up on May 20th, and on the following day, depth charges had been detonated under the hulks of Admiral Hipper and Emden. This was judged enough to render them destroyed by the deadline. The wrecks were broken up in situ from 1948 onwards, the Eisen- und Metallkonzern having quoted for their scrapping in April. In July, under the supervision of British authorities, the remains were raised and towed to Heikendorf Bay and beached so that the scrapping process could begin. The scrapping process began in 1948 and lasted until 1952, where in this photo, the Admiral Hipper is suffering from an accidental fire as she was dumped in shallow water after the removal from the dry dock in June 1945. Refloating the Admiral Hipper was not permitted by the Potsdam Agreement, since she was not forming an obstruction to navigation. Rather, her hull was damaged beyond salvage by the detonation of those charges we discussed earlier, and thus not worthy of saving, being scrapped over the coming years. Seydlitz was an interesting ship, where she was laid down on December 29, 1936, where the vessel was launched on January 19, 1939. When the war came, work slowed on the cruiser much like her sister Lützow, as we'll see later on, although in December 1939 she was 95% complete. Seydlitz caught the attention of the Soviets, and they had interest in purchasing the ship, but it didn't go anywhere due to the Soviets purchasing Lützow. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper-class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, building work slowed on the outbreak of war, greater priority being placed on new U-boats, destroyers, and smaller warships, and Seydlitz languished in the shipyard. The sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941 and the rapidly growing awareness that the German Navy needed an aerial component led to talks on May 13th and June 15th, 1942, in which the idea of converting Seydlitz into an aircraft carrier was discussed. This was finally ordered by Hitler on August 26, 1942, and conversion work began at once. B and C main turrets were landed, and the superstructure was dismantled. The ship was exposed at Bremen to the real and present threat of Allied bombers. Thus, the hull was transferred to the somewhat safer Königsberg in East Prussia for safety. But in January 1943, construction work was finally halted. Seydlitz was scuttled in Königsberg on the 29th of January 1945 as the military situation got worse and worse. In early April, the Soviets began their offensive to capture the ancient German city. The ship was destroyed with explosives in the city to prevent the Soviets from using the ship. But taking from Dodson and Kahn again, although a Category C ship, studies had been undertaken towards completing Seydlitz, both as a carrier and as a cruiser alongside her sister Tallinn, ex-Petropavlovsk, ex-Lützow, with Seydlitz given priority and components from Tallinn if necessary to get her out of to-be-destroyed category. Both ships were now to be armed with 12 152mm and 12 100mm guns, as in the new Project 6B vessels, were due to be completed by the end of 1949. However, Seydlitz was stricken on March 10, 1947, in anticipation of the March 19th degree, and broken up. She was broken up over the coming years. The completion of the scrapping was in the late 1950s. Our story with Prinz Eugen begins back in mid-1944 after recommissioning in 1943 and joining the Fleet Training Group. If you want to learn more about the decommissioning of all heavy units, I'll link to the playlist for this series. Anyway, in June 1944, Prinz Eugen patrolled the Finnish coast north of the island of Uto in a show of strength to cover the German withdrawal when Finland was going to leave the war. In July, there wasn't much of anything to note for her service. In August, however, there was quite a bit of action, as off Kurland in the Gulf of Riga, the cruiser spent 265 rounds of her main battery, 20.3cm or 8-inch guns on Soviet positions at Tukum, a rail and road junction about 25 kilometers inland, while our escorting destroyers and torpedo boats engaged other targets. On the 2nd of September, she returned to Finland following the nation bowing out of the war. In mid-October, the ship sailed to Gottenhofen, today what is Gdynia in Poland, for 5 days and attacked a little under 30 targets in the defense of the Baltic coast near Memel, expending almost 1,200 rounds of her main battery guns in company with another heavy cruiser that had recommissioned, the Lützow, formerly the Deutschland. On the return to Gottenhofen on the night of the 15th, at full speed, Prinz Eugen ran the light cruiser Leipzig, which was adrift while making a routine engine coupling transfer. Both ships remained locked together until the next day. Leipzig, although heavily damaged, remained afloat. While Prinz Eugen lost a section of her bow, she returned to Gottenhofen yards, where thanks to personal initiative of the naval senior architect, Professor Burkhardt, the same man who had designed the class, a new stem was added on in a few days and tested on the 14th of November. The cruiser was again operational, and on the 20th, in company with the torpedo boats T-21, T-13, T-16, and T-19, bombarded Soviet positions near the Swob Peninsula. After this, she returned to Gottenhofen again, where she was scheduled for a refit and rebore of her guns. The refit work was completed on January 15th, and only 2 weeks later, Prinz Eugen and torpedo boats covered the breakout of the 28th Corps from the bridgehead at Königsberg, where in the defense of these troops, she expended a further 871 rounds of her main battery guns. Still, the Soviet advance could not be stopped by her own or other German guns. Through the coming months of winter and spring 1945, Prinz Eugen covered the retreating German army around the Baltic, much like other ships we have discussed like the Lützow, Admiral Hipper, and Admiral Scheer. On March 7th, the Soviets advanced on the cities of Danzig, Gdynia, and Hel. Prinz Eugen was involved in the defense of those cities from March 10th on. In the defense of those cities, a total of 2,025 rounds of 20.3 centimeter and 2,446 15-centimeter shells were fired by the various ships involved in the defense. During this period, Prinz Eugen also supported the old pre-dreadnought Schlesien and later the repaired Leipzig. After Hel had been evacuated and abandoned in mid-April, Prinz Eugen eventually retired to Copenhagen on April 19th, joining the light cruiser Nürnberg, where, to quote Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War, the fate of the enemy fleets after 2 world wars. A considerable number of German vessels were in Danish waters at the time of the surrender, in particular, those involved in the Baltic evacuations. Considerable friction resulted when Danish elements attempted to board German vessels, the latter's crews not recognizing the Danes as victors, only the British to whom they had formerly surrendered under the May 5th agreement. Apart from the big ships, the replenishment ship Nordmark, together with T-47, T-107, T-108, and T-151, and other smaller vessels, had been at Copenhagen on the 7th. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy. In the coming days, the 2 ships were escorted to Wilhelmshaven by the cruisers Devonshire and Dido, arriving in the harbor locks on the 26th of May. Prinz Eugen was lodged in the 40,000-ton floating dock in the city, but since all of her ammunition had already been shipped at Copenhagen, little else remained to be done to the heavy cruiser. On June 2nd, after a final commander's parade, a large contingent of the crew was disembarked, and those remaining aboard were subjected to close watch. Nevertheless, many objects of traditional or historical value were smuggled off the ship. During this period of being laid up, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers of Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nürnberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR, because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939 and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces over the last year of the war, the British wanted her in part for her role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for the technology, if that's to be believed. There are some sources that say the United States didn't even want the ship, and one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, which was Prinz Eugen, 1 Type 1936A destroyer and 5 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Y, which was Nürnberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Z, 8 Type 1936A destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson Crank again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw. And later that day, the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans. Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. This result was enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American enclave within the British zone of occupation. On January 5, 1946, Prinz Eugen was commissioned into the United States Navy under the designation IX-300 to designate that she was a war prize, but retaining the name Prinz Eugen. She left German waters that day for Britain. To sail her there and for technical investigations of her machinery and other technologies, a large part of her German crew was retained and remustered aboard, particularly the weapons specialist, signal navigation specialist, underwater acoustic staff, and engine room staff. These were important because the Americans weren't well versed in the high-pressure hot steam plant. Dodson and Kant have this to say. Although both Nagato and Sakawa sailed with U.S. crews, both did not get commissioned. However, Prinz Eugen was commissioned under her original name, and the hull number was IX-300. On January 5, 1946, with a composite American-German crew, she sailed from Weserübung for Boston in January, arriving on the 22nd. The cruiser was examined on arrival, a number of her components being removed for trials and further analysis. Her passive sonar being installed in USS Flying Fish. The guns of the foremost turret were removed at Philadelphia in February, together with two 105mm mountings, a set of torpedo tubes, light AA guns, and several rangefinders. The cruiser arrived off the United States East Coast in late January, arriving in Boston on the 23rd, and then on to Philadelphia, leaving on February 11th for the Panama Canal, which she transited on the 15th. Once in the Pacific, a comprehensive examination of the hydrophones was undertaken, and the cruiser called in San Pedro on March 24th. From April 10th to May 1st, the torpedoes were thoroughly investigated. When the German crew was no longer needed, contingents of the German crew were disembarked in 3 groups, and on May 1st, Captain Reinecke and the remainder of the crew were landed on May 1st, 1946. The Americans subsequently had some serious problems with the cruiser's machinery. A breakdown of all but one boiler on the passage from San Diego to Hawaii. The cruiser was brought with tug assistance to Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands via Honolulu. On July 1st, 1946, the first post-war atom bomb test was carried out on a group of 11 warships, including the heavy cruiser. Prinz Eugen proved resilient to the blast, and there was little damage aboard the ship, this being test-able, although all animals were killed aboard the vessel. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper-class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, "The second A device exploded on July 25th was an underwater bomb, Test Baker. The ship remained afloat, but was heavily irradiated. As a result, the intention to repair and recommission her was abandoned, and the hull was towed to Kwajalein Atoll and anchored. Because of the long period she spent in tropical waters, the stuffing glands and outboard vents of the ship began to leak, and on December 22nd she capsized. There the wreck lies today, minus various parts removed before the tests. The ship's bell hangs in the Navy Museum, Washington, the Tegethoff bell is displayed at Graz, and one of the 2 propellers was obtained by the German Navy League in 1979 and mounted in front of the Naval Memorial at Le Beau. The heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen and the light cruiser Nürnberg were the only 2 major German warships to survive the war undamaged and passed to the victors at capitulation. Finally, we have the Lützow, laid down on August 2nd, 1937. The ship was launched on July 1st, 1939. The hull was fitted on the stocks with the Atlantic prow, in contrast to the Four Sisters, which had been launched with a straight stem. Once the Second World War broke out, completion work slowed due to the demands of the war, something akin to the incomplete aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin. Shortly before Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans and Soviets had a non-aggression pact. In addition to covering their back, the Soviets expressed a strong interest in acquiring new warships, of which, amongst others, the cruiser Lutzow, Seydlitz, the complete Prinz Eugen, and possibly the battleship Bismarck headed the list. Admiral Erich Raeder didn't necessarily want to transfer any ships or materials except concerning the Lutzow. On the 15th of April 1940, the unfinished vessel was taken in tow to Leningrad and handed over to the Soviet Navy. Around 70 men headed with the ship, acting as advisors until June 1941, when they were recalled before the German attack. To take from Koop and Schmolke again, the Soviets renamed the ship Petropavlovsk. Building work was not undertaken with any urgency, and she was still short of completion when Germany invaded on June 22, 1941. Leningrad was obviously to be a major objective, and the so-called Battle Flotte, comprised of all Russian units in the Baltic in August 1941, was formed into a support flotilla for the Leningrad front. The first group was concentrated on the Neva front, the second with the partially immobile cruiser Maxim Gorky, the incomplete Petropavlovsk ex-Lützow, with only the two main forward turrets fitted. The destroyer Leningrad as flotilla leader, 5 other destroyers and a mine layer lay off Leningrad. The third group was concentrated on the Oranienburg-Kronstadt area. On the 15th of September 1941, the Petropavlovsk was slightly damaged by German 15-centimeter shells from artillery inland. She did survive the shelling and the deterioration in the local military situation 3 days later. Luftwaffe raids in early April caused serious damage to the ship, and she sank and grounded in shallow water. She was refloated in September 1942 with her main guns intact, enabling her to continue to engage land targets. From autumn of 1943, she served as a floating battery. In the period between January 14th and the 21st, 1944, Soviet troops broke through the ring encircling the city of Leningrad. The battle flotte, which included the Petropavlovsk, which was now called the Talon, contributed to this breakout. She was laid up for a long period after the war, where she was scrapped in 1960. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I figured I'd take a look at the whole Admiral Hipper-class and make one coherent video on them. I'm still looking to get more sources on the Nürnberg or the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz won't be too difficult though. Let me know if you'd like to see any other class-related video. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.